Yes, Dolly. If you could just do a little self-introduction of yourself first to give our audience a bit of background of who you are. So maybe like pronouns, and then just any identities that you'd like us to know.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, Cynthia. I'm Dolly Lee. I'm a video journalist and correspondent, and I've worked mostly across international news media networks, working both in the US and abroad. And I'm currently based in LA, working independently now as a filmmaker, and I go by she, her, and I'm very excited to be part of the show.
Thank you, Dolly. And just to give a little bit more context as to who you are for our audience out there, Dolly is being very humble right here. But
I hate this part.
Dolly, oh my goodness. So Dolly is an Emmy Award-winning video journalist, filmmaker, and now podcaster. You worked on a short doc series about Chinese Americans for Al Jazeera's digital magazine, AJ Plus. You're a co-founder of Goldthread and a founder of Plum Radio with your co-host Joey Yang. Plum Radio explores news and pop culture from an Asian perspective. Dolly, I'm just really excited to talk to you. You're an absolute role model for me, so thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you. That's always amazing to hear.
So let's get right into it. I want to get a little more background about how you got involved in Asian American media spaces. Obviously, it's a bit of a limited space, I guess, in
hmm
some ways. So how did you come to be so involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess one could say that Asian American is a limited space. A lot of people do see it as niche, but the reality is being Asian American is also just being part of the Asian diaspora. And when you take that perspective, the diaspora is huge, it's a
Mm.
huge chunk of the world, and that diaspora they all speak different languages, but so many of us can also bond around English and the ways our language or culture might be bastardized in English. So I think that's why, Asian American, despite it in the US being small, has bigger ripple effects than just us. And so I would say I got started covering Asian American and international Asian communities probably around 2016, 2017. When I first started working with Al Jazeera at their digital outlet AJ Plus, that was in 2014, which was the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, back when there were protests in Ferguson, back when, Mike Brown was killed. And, AJ Plus really gave me this foundation in understanding social justice, political reporting. And so much of what we covered as journalists back in 2014 was what was happening in the streets of Ferguson. We covered a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement. My early days as a journalist, I did a lot of research on prison reform, on issues surrounding solitary confinement, on issues surrounding policing and education. And I was just learning and seeing just the amount of activism and organization that the Black community had in terms of, getting their message out, making sure that they're heard, that they're seen, and also just telling their stories in a way that humanizes why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important. That truly inspired me to think more about my own Asian American identity, seeing and learning so much about how the civil rights movement brought together not just, Black activists, but also activists of color, Asian, Latino, immigrant communities, refugee communities. And that was really where I felt that, there's an opportunity to also tell our stories, to tell it in a way that really humanizes the Asian American experience beyond, honestly, my own of being a New Yorker, beyond the ones of just being from California, which is often what we see when we hear about the Asian American narrative. And so that's how that journey got started. But a lot of it is due to learning so much about the history of Black activists.
Yeah, and just going off of that, I think that is literally what's also compelled us to start AZ in the beginning of this year. I think there's this rise of of bobo liberalism identity within Asian American communities, where the identity and the term Asian American as a political identity and political movement, as a solidarity movement, sometimes gets lost at times. It's a bit of a delicate solidarity umbrella term that we have, and so thinking about your work with Plum Radio, and specifically, like, I remember your first episode was about bobo liberalism. What was like the moment that made you say, I have to start this podcast?
Yeah, so Plum Radio has actually been a figment of my imagination for some time now. The work I create, the video work I create, normally takes quite a bit of time to put out. Sometimes these videos will take 3 months, right? You shoot it, and then even
Mm-hmm.
working on a fast timeline, it's 3 months, which doesn't allow for that weekly conversation on, trending and, major talking points that are on the front of our minds for, every week that we're living in, right? And so much of 2020 just came to a head very, very quickly between the pandemic and it being an election year. And it felt like the time was ripe to start having these conversations, especially ones that challenge the politics, the mainstream politics that we may often see in Asian American communities, what we often may call bobo liberalism, right? Blind subscription to representation matters, and that's all that matters. Thinking a bit more complex and much more deeply about, who are the elected officials that we would want to support who are Asian, and thinking a little more deeply about, what kind of media and what kind of content we want to see come out of our community. So Plum Radio was at first an endeavor to just want to reach my audience and a bigger audience on a more frequent basis. And as the global pandemic kicked off, it just showed how much we needed in the United States and the West in general, and West being an arbitrary term because what is West and what is East? But in the West, in the political West, needing to understand what was happening in Asia, if we were actually paying attention to how globalized our world really is and how much what happens in Asia affects us, what happens in China affects us, the US probably would have known in January 2020 that this pandemic was going to be really bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Chinese New Year was canceled in 2020 is something that is such a magnitude of a decision. It's like telling Americans that Christmas is canceled, right? It's like telling them, don't go anywhere, don't see your parents, do not celebrate, stay in your house. That's how drastic that was. But because there was a lack of cultural understanding, people didn't realize that, right? And it took until,
Mm-hmm.
for most places, March, April, for any type of policy to really go in place to start protecting citizens. And as a result, how many hundreds of thousands of American lives have we lost at this point, right? What are we? We're in the
Mm-hmm.
300,000, nearing 400,000. Maybe we've already surpassed 400,000, and we're still living in it. So it felt like just the culmination of what was happening in the world and how politics and activism was changing, that something like Plum Radio had space and had an audience to be able to just talk about geopolitics beyond, honestly, the American framework.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely, I think, like one of the key reasons we had started at the moment as a podcast as well. Just the space to be able to talk about a lot of these issues in a much more complex manner, and also um, bringing light to the reality that, like, these issues that are developing internationally, domestically, within this specific Asian American communities and smaller communities within, um, affect everyone. And so just thinking about all of the ripple effects of that, I think, is definitely needed within Asian American or just news media spaces in general. Yeah, I think, like, talking a bit about Plum Radio, how did like creating the show kind of work for you? I know for us it was a lot in the beginning of trying to script and trying to find guests and then building a team to be able to make something at the level that we're trying to make it at. So, how did you and your co host kind of go about that in the beginnings?
Well, I'm very fortunate that my co-host is also one of my longtime friends, and we've always had a really wonderful, a chemistry in terms of conversation about politics and about race, but also just about, the stupid things that we're into. And we've always had that bond. So it was nice to be able to create something with a friend, especially going into it, believing like this is truly, yeah, it's an artistic endeavor, right? Like when the art no longer feels fun, then that's when we have to like take a break and think about, what is it that we're creating here? So we really started the endeavor thinking of it as an act of love, art, and passion for, the conversations that we've already been having. And how we got things started, really, because of the pandemic and the lockdown, we kicked things off on Instagram Live. We had, piloted a concept, the Boba liberalism episode, which we eventually released as a special bonus episode to show the foundation of Plum Radio. But there was such an urgency and immediacy for reaching people in their homes, reaching people in their, quarantine normal. When, I mean, if you can even imagine what the state of the world was like in March, I was still in New York at that time too. Everyone was so afraid, right? Everyone was so scared, especially in New York. Nobody really left the house. People were afraid to even go outside. So the Instagram Live format allowed us to both be a little more inventive with the podcast format. It allowed us to have some interesting guests who also needed to plug their work, because with so many of these businesses like movie theaters and gatherings where you would normally screen, say, like a short film or, new work, all of those things being canceled, people need to reach their audiences virtually. And Plum Radio was also a good way for these people to plug their new content as well. So it was also, part of it was strategic, right? And I say as a journalist who's worked mostly in the digital space, strategy is a huge part of creation. You want to make sure you set yourself up for success, and creating an Instagram Live on a very visual a platform allows for you to build an audience a bit more quickly, because then you constantly have new guests on, and those guests bring in their followers. So that was kind of where things started, just responding to the state of the world, responding to the need for just very human connection, like face-to-face connection when everyone is kind of barred from seeing each other. And then also creating a format that would facilitate these essentially interview style conversations without it being just a traditional podcast.
Mm. Yeah, that's definitely, I think, pandemic quarantine gave rise to a list of podcasts during this time, especially of that need for human connection and that need to understand everything that's happening um, during these, many have said, unprecedented times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, yeah, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and just kind of go into a conversation about just Asian American as a term and identity. For you personally, when was the first time you came across the term? And do you even remember? And kind of how did you come to identify with it?
Well, I've always felt, I've always identified as Chinese American, as, Asian. Asian American as a full term, maybe not so much until adulthood, but definitely always saw myself as someone who's Asian. I would say that, really understanding the history and origins of the word Asian American came with doing the research for my Al Jazeera series, the Chinese Food in America series that was released in 2017. We did a lot of research with historians, academics, with people who are Asian studies professors, and it was really being in California. I lived in Oakland for 5 years, really being there in the Bay, in the hub where the word Asian American was created, that I got this very important foundation of knowledge that I was lacking my entire life. It took me until I was, 25 to really understand the word Asian American and the significance of that historically, politically, and where it can take us in the future. So, the term Asian American was born out of these movements, these student movements that took place in San Francisco, that students who were advocating for Asian American studies at their universities. And Asian American, the Asian community being quite small at that time, and a lot of them coming from lower income backgrounds, needed a way to unify all folks who identified as Asian, right? East Asian, South Asian, Pacific Islander, to be able to advocate for themselves as a louder voice. So that was really when I, started using the term Asian American more myself as well, when I started understanding the history and significance and power of being able to create a coalition.
Yeah, definitely. I think same for me. I didn't really come across the political meanings of the term until I took an Asian American Studies class in college. And it's very upsetting, I think, and almost traumatizing to go through a class to learn how much wasn't taught to us,
Mm-hmm.
um, from early childhood to high school. And then for many who didn't get to take an Asian American Studies class,
Mm-hmm.
like you, just like learning it through research and later parts of just working life, and coming to terms with all of that is definitely traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
I think for just thinking about the identity and the term, we like AZ have really talked a lot about. I think a lot of our product and a lot of our podcast specifically is really thinking about Asian American as a political identity and as a movement, and trying to answer this question of whether this movement is still holds the same water as it did from that third world, liberation front that happened in San Francisco in the 60s. Like, is that term still as coalition building, as a good solidarity building term today in the 2020s? I wonder if you have a take on that, of like whether you think Asian American as a term as political movement is still holding the same sentiment as the 60s.
Right. That's a good question because there has been a lot of debate in the Asian American community of whether or not that term is effective. However, I do see these stories and I see the movement from, I think we have to look both internally and externally. And this comes with part of, the strategy of creating content as well. Externally, outside of our own Asian American communities, nobody is debating the term Asian American.
Mm-hmm.
It's not effective for them. It's not relevant even. They don't, there's so much nuance, of course. We know as Asian Americans, there's nuance and very stark differences between how much, the socioeconomic backgrounds of certain immigrant groups. We know in our community that, the darker your skin, the more you're discriminated against. We know that Pacific Islanders face very different, histories of colonization by the US that, immigrants from China may not have faced, right? We know that, a lot of the newer, or not newer, but, a lot of the immigrants, say in California, who came from, say, Taiwan or Hong Kong in the 70s and 80s, were way more well off and way more educated than, say, my parents who came in the 80s. So we internally know that there is a lot of layers in how these terms, kind of condense everyone into one group. But outside of ourselves, it's so hard already to convince the rest of the world to care about Asian American stories. And when internally we're also asking for a segmentation, it's like, oh, I don't want you to care about Asian American stories. I want you to care about Southeast Asian American stories. Most Americans don't even know where Southeast Asia is. They don't have an understanding of
Mm.
this. And so that's why I think, like, yes, it's important to philosophically talk about it because what it comes down to is acknowledging racism, colorism, and the differences in our socioeconomic status. But I think that outwardly disintegrating this term is
Mm.
a long run really just going to do us more harm than good because anyone outside of the Asian American sphere, which is about 6 to 7% of the United States, that's 92% of your country, if not more, does not care to unpack the term nor to understand all the different regions that are involved in that term. We're just not a big enough group yet for us to really take that type of grouping apart, at least externally.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely hear you on that. I work for, on my day job, I actually work for Admirasia, which is a Asian American marketing agency. And so just talking to brands about
Mm-hmm.
Asian American as a consumer market is probably 80% education just
Mm-hmm.
on the term, on the identity, on who your target audience even is. And the sad thing is they kind of label themselves as more of like a multicultural agency because that term just hasn't left the minds of larger brands yet. Is it hasn't shifted to the current conversation of BIPOC or more like holistic, more 2020 terms of like how we describe um, communities of color. But now it's still part of the agency's identity because we will not get searched for if we do not include it in our language. So I think there's definitely almost a kind of we have to keep this term for the sake of just being visible
Mm-hmm.
on so many fronts. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting that you work at an ad agency that focuses on Asian consumers or people trying to market to Asian consumers. I'm curious, like, have you guys seen more interest from brands and products to reach this community? And what are the ways that you guys tell brands that, the Asian community is worthwhile? Because that's of course, a very
Yeah.
different approach from content, but there is a lot of overlap as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think for so Admirasia has been around since the 90s, and so it's the conversation has shifted over the years. However, I think the large sentiment of thinking that Asian American as a demographic isn't worthwhile enough is still there,
Mhm.
unfortunately. There is this overwhelming sense from a lot of brands, especially larger brands, that think Asian American as a demographic and consumer patterns actually align very closely with white consumer patterns. And so there is no need to specifically target Asian Americans as a group. So there's no need for that specific representation either. So that is something that is we're always pushing back on. Another thing is just kind of trying to again talk about desegregating data within Asian American just communities. And I think it's very hard because there isn't a lot of data that disaggregates all of the Asian American communities. And so thinking about how we target things like, especially Lunar New Year, has become a huge part of brands trying to advertise to Asian Americans, but not knowing the how that's specifically very East Asian, and what kinds of celebrations are behind that, and then trying to get a sense of where Asian Americans are in terms of English speaking demographics and what the background is currently in terms of 2021 Lunar New Year, which looks very different from past years. Um, Trying to get brands to essentially just understand that this community is first off there, second off different from actually white communities. And yeah, our work, a lot of it does have to do with trying to collect data and trying to disaggregate and doing a lot of that research ourselves because there just isn't enough out there.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that definitely makes sense. And, the need for data, of course, is super important, and desegregating that data is super important too. And I think people are just starting to think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's dangerous, especially for COVID times.
Yeah.
And yeah, just looking at all of the data that has supported that Asian Americans are doing just fine during COVID, when in reality, there is so much in terms of just how casteism plays into it, how socioeconomic class and migration patterns play into it. Definitely something that I think API data is doing well in. Just shout out to
Hmm.
them.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, they're great.
yeah, but honestly, I can't think of many other organizations that are doing that. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a good start, you know. I think again, internally, I think it's worthwhile for Asian Americans to be aware of how the data can be desegregated. Um, but externally, again, like the word Asian American, it's really hard to not use it, right?
yeah,
It's hard enough to get people to adopt Asian American, let alone any other term.
yeah. I think since we are running very low on time now, just to kind of do a wrap up question of, is there any conversations that you believe the community needs to still navigate? There's many, obviously, but if you were to kind of think about one that Asian American as community needs to reckon with, is there a specific one?
You know, I think this election cycle has brought up a lot more issues for the Asian American community to think about than any other year. And if there is any silver lining that came out of this pandemic, I think that it is the gentle awakening I'm seeing among Asian Americans. You know, really wonderful to see the publication that you guys are putting out because that's exactly what we need. We need more. You know, we need more everything, all of it, right? We need more. We need more TV. We need more documentary. We need more media publications. We need more data. We need all of that. And from the protests of the Black Lives Matter movement this past summer to, you know, addressing the racism and xenophobia that came out of the pandemic, to also seeing now, you know, you have a woman who is South Asian in the vice president's seat, you know, and even the conversations around when Andrew Yang was trying to run for president, politics has become more and more at the forefront of Asian American conversations, whether or not people want to have that conversation or not. And I encourage Asian Americans to really have that conversation, to actually just get into the politics. It seems like a simple thing, right? Politics is just another, you know, catch-all phrase for anything people talk about. But so often Asian Americans are excluded from conversations of politics because the assumption is that we don't care, right? And yes, we can point fingers and be like, no, no, we do care, look, or we can, you know, more truly act on it and make it be clear that we do care. And I think part of that, it requires us to engage in conversations of politics, to write about it, to confront it, you know, to not just be focused on the Black Lives Matter movement when it's trending, right? To talk about, you know, the ways that socioeconomic differences have impacted our communities, but also to engage ourselves in greater US conversations of, you know, what does it mean for, you know, there to be a new Democratic president coming in? What does it mean for there to be a lot of moderates? What does it mean for, you know, the United States president to be muted on Twitter? What does all of that mean, right? And not necessarily even what does it mean for me as an Asian American, but participating in greater general politics. I think it's where I hope Asian Americans can push more of in the future.
Absolutely, completely. Well, Dolly, thank you so much for joining us today, and very excited to possibly hear season 3 of Plum Radio. And yeah, we'll connect soon.
Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks for having me, and congratulations on the launch.
Thank you so much. We're so excited.